Détente and the End of the Cold War, Part 1, The End of a 46-Year-Old Bad Dream. This is a map of Europe during the Cold War, and you can see sort of the classic two sides thing going on. You have in the east the Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviet Union, communist countries all, and then in the west you had democratic capitalist countries, at least in Europe, and eventually including some countries that weren't democratic, all of which were effectively capitalist, however. And then there was, of course, the Iron Curtain that split the two sides in half, which wasn't a literal Iron Curtain, but it was extremely well armed, lots of barbed wire minefields, two armies facing off against each other. This was kind of the trip line for the Cold War. If there had been a war here, it would have been a nuclear war, and a significant percentage of the human population would have been killed. Remember, of course, that Berlin, West and East Berlin, particularly West Berlin, is nestled deep in the heart of East Germany, and so that's that. And then there would be a Berlin Wall around West Berlin to keep communists from getting in, including actually on the other side, because it is actually in the middle of East Germany. And of course, around communist China, you had a very similar sort of thing. Not exactly Iron Curtain, but you definitely saw a stare down between Western-oriented, NATO-oriented, often democracies, especially later on, versus the communists. Obviously, the Soviet Union is also an Asian country, in addition to being a European country. So here's the Asian side of the Soviet Union, and then you had China, North Korea, North Vietnam, although that would eventually become all of Vietnam when South Vietnam, which had been a U.S. client state, not at all democratic, but on our side, at least, because they were anti-communist. They were, of course, defeated by the North Vietnamese, and Cambodia would eventually fall to communism. The Japanese were democratic and were a strong U.S. ally. The Philippines was not usually democratic, and for a long time was run by a U.S.-supported dictator who was quite brutal. There were problems in Indonesia along similar lines. Pakistan, although a lot of countries did try and stay out of the Cold War, these gray countries, which is kind of depressing because they weren't gray, they were just places, but they did not want anything to do with the Cold War. So the Cold War could have been lost by everyone, but there was never any chance the communists were going to win. And this is the economics of why that is true. So, despite its inherent inequality and tendency to booms and busts, capitalism is a far more productive and inventive productive system or economic system than communism is. And so that in and of itself meant that the NATO side of things, the US-led side of things, was always kind of going to be in the lead. That was particularly helped out with the formation of the European Union in 1958, which was at the beginning just a few countries, France and Germany and Italy and a couple of the smaller countries, unifying to try and create some kind of like common economic structure. All of that, as of course, has by now developed into literally a common border, moves toward a common military and an extremely integrated economy. And similar trade blocks in Asia meant that capitalist economies or capitalist-leaning economies were more integrated, more productive, more successful, and also way more unified. France and Germany and Italy and the United Kingdom and all these countries, Japan, were now so closely intertwined economically that it would have been very difficult for them to A, leave that economic structure, and B, for them not to get to know each other and therefore make war a great deal more difficult. And obviously the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, also added to that unity, which meant that the NATO side, or the Western side, was productive economically and also quite unified. The Soviet Union kind of had a fake version of that. They did have the Warsaw Pact, which was theoretically like NATO, although in practice that was basically Soviet domination and little puppet governments providing support troops. And obviously, economically speaking, the communist world was completely inefficient and ecologically and every kind of way destructive you can kind of think of, but mostly it just couldn't keep up with the production of capitalist West. They couldn't make as many refrigerators and radios and blue jeans and all that other stuff, and that became a problem over time. This car is a lot, and it's a good example of what went wrong with the Soviet Union. It is the car that sort of everyone drove in the Soviet Union. They really didn't make a lot of models of cars. This was the most popular of them, and it was kind of a piece of crap car. Inefficient, broke down a lot, not terribly safe, boring looking. It's fine in kind of a cute retro sort of way, but if this were the only car really available to an entire people, it's not the most exciting kind of culture. And people like flashy, weird stuff. And in the Soviet Union, you really kind of couldn't have that. Anywhere in the Warsaw Pact or China, you couldn't have that. And so capitalism, to a lot of people in the communist world, seemed more appealing. And of course, capitalism produces something for everyone, and if they don't produce it, you can just customize it. So up in the top left there, you can see a completely impractical Camaro. Definitely not the working man's car, but super fun to drive. You can take your Impala and you can trick it out into a really awesome lowrider. You can buy a Bronco if that's what interests you. You can get it in 100 different colors. You can buy a super suave French sedan. Consumer goods and innovation and differentiation were the ideas of the West, and people in the communist world were jealous. The Cold War could have been lost by everyone, but the communists could never have won it. Military reasons. So the communists did have a manpower advantage, particularly after the rise of communist China. There were a lot more forces on the communist side. However, their poverty and technology ensured that these big armies were kind of hollow. They were terrifying, but they just weren't as good technologically as the Western armies. And it kind of didn't matter anyway, because of mutually assured destruction. With mutually assured destruction, who's going to have a conventional war? So having a bunch of soldiers in an army, like the Chinese or the Russians did, was kind of a waste of money and time. It just didn't help anything, because you couldn't use the army anyway, you'd get nuked. There were also proxy wars going on, and I'll talk about that in a later slide, and those did brutalize third world nations. But even when the communists won those, it wasn't enough. There were too many nations on the Western side, on the NATO side, on the US side, for the Soviets really to budge things. And communism wasn't appealing enough to get a lot of nations on their side anyway. And even though technology had started fairly equally between the two countries, particularly after the Soviets stole the plans for nuclear weapons, over time, the West just expanded its technology and improved its technology really rapidly. And that's Europe, the United States, the Japanese, all of the West. Those technologies increased anywhere from rockets to computers to medical advances to the early internet, all of those things. The West pulled further and further ahead, largely because their scientists could talk to each other, because there wasn't the same like totalitarian system crushing speech. All those stupid consumer goods, you know, making weird toys and cars and all that other stuff that the Soviets was a waste of time and money, that did improve technology, and that did not happen in the Soviet Union and China. And the key proxy wars that did rip up the third world or the non-communist, non-capitalist world were really brutal. And for those people, the war was hot. It wasn't just a Cold War in Cuba, in Vietnam, in a whole ton of insurgencies throughout Africa, Latin America, and Asia, which led to the death of literally millions of peoples. And then both sides, the Warsaw Pact and the NATO side, supported military dictatorships, as long as those military dictatorships were either anti-communist or anti-capitalist, depending on how you looked at it, or anti-West anyway. And so for our part, the United States side, the French and the British and all that stuff, we supported some really, truly awful dictatorships in Chile, in Brazil, in Argentina, Zaire, Angola, the Philippines, Indonesia, all over the place. Marcos and Mobutu Sese Seko and Pinochet, to name some of the worst of those dictators. These were people who really severely abused their own people, murdered them, tortured them, but we supported them, armed them, and played nice with those dictators because they weren't communists. The communists did their exact same thing. They obviously supported all the dictatorial governments of the Warsaw Pact nations, so Eastern Europe, like Poland and Bulgaria and Romania. And then they also supported some terrible governments, the worst of which was probably the Cambodian Khmer Rouge government that killed about a third of its own population. The North Koreans were dangerous people. The Cuban Communist government was probably I guess, the nicest of the communist governments, but even there was fairly homophobic, deeply inefficient, and totalitarian. And so both sides supported bad people in order to win the Cold War. And this map shows some of those wars that did take place within the Cold War. Some of these are not specifically Cold War things, like the Biafran War or the Iran-Iraq War, but most of the rest of these are ones that you can think of as proxy wars, where one side or the other, the communists or the capitalists, supported some one side to kill the other side. And as you can see, there are millions and millions of people killed in proxy wars, the Cold War in Afro-Eurasia, which is what part of the globe you're looking at here. Here you can see a list of similar situations that took place in Latin America, where you have dictatorships or U.S. interventions or counterinsurgencies or communist insurgencies. So a lot of violence in Latin America. Even though there was technically not a lot of war here, there were plenty of people killed by their own governments or by guerrillas attempting to overthrow governments. End of part one. Part two does describe détente and the end of the Cold War, but this is a good breaking place to take a moment and review and maybe take some notes before moving on to the second part of the lecture.